Mother called me one evening, her voice trembling as if every word cost her an effort. She told me she felt unwell, that doctors had run tests but could not say much, and that she feared being alone. I lived in Moscow, thousands of kilometers away, and though we talked often, I had not visited Vladivostok in 3 long years. Work, responsibilities, and my own life had kept me distant. That night, I lay awake in bed, haunted by the sound of her fragile voice. What if something happened to her while I was away? What if I never had the chance to make things right between us? By dawn, I had bought a ticket. 2 days later, I was on a flight eastward, bracing myself for what awaited. I imagined sterile hospital corridors, her frail figure attached to machines. And my heart ached at the thought of her suffering alone. Asterisk, when the plane landed, the familiar salty air of Vladivostok greeted me, along with an overwhelming wave of nostalgia. I dragged my suitcase through the terminal, memories of childhood visits rushing back. The taxi ride home felt surreal, each street carrying whispers of my past. My mother's building looked unchanged, the same peeling paint, the same cracked steps. With shaking hands, I carried my luggage up the stairs. I expected silence, maybe the smell of medicine. Instead, the door swung open before I could knock. There stood my mother, her cheeks rosy, her eyes bright, and not a hint of illness in sight. I froze, torn between relief and confusion. She pulled me into a hug, warm and strong, whispering how much she had missed me. Asterisk, for a moment, I was speechless. The image of hospital beds evaporated, replaced by the familiar scent of her cooking and the warmth of home. "But you said you were sick," I finally managed, pulling back to look into her face. She smiled with a hint of mischief and admitted she had exaggerated. She wasn't dying, not even close. She just knew that nothing else would bring me back. My chest tightened, anger and guilt colliding inside me. I wanted to yell, but I couldn't, because part of me felt immense relief that she was fine. I let her lead me into the apartment, where the table was already set with dishes I hadn't tasted in years. Dumplings, fish, salads. It felt like a trap and a welcome home party rolled into one. Asterisk, we sat at the table, and she began talking as if nothing unusual had happened. She asked about my work, my life, my friends. I answered mechanically, my thoughts swirling. Had she really lied to me about being ill? I glanced around the apartment, noticing little changes. New curtains, freshly painted walls, family photographs rearranged. Everything seemed carefully prepared, as though she had been waiting for this moment for months. My frustration slowly melted into something more complicated, a realization that she had been desperately lonely. Still, I couldn't ignore the sting of manipulation. I asked her why she had to resort to pretending. She sighed, her eyes soft, and said, "Because you wouldn't come otherwise." Asterisk, her words pierced me more deeply than I expected. She was right. I had been so absorbed in my own world that I barely thought of how empty her days must have been. My father had long passed away, neighbors had moved, and most of her friends were either gone or too old to visit often. She spent hours alone in the small apartment, waiting for my calls that grew shorter and less frequent. I felt the weight of my neglect pressing down on me. She had tricked me, yes, but beneath that was a cry for love, a plea for connection. My anger subsided, replaced by guilt and sorrow. I reached across the table and took her hand. Asterisk, that evening stretched into the night. We talked for hours, peeling away years of distance. She told me stories I hadn't heard before about my father's youth, about her struggles raising me alone, about sacrifices she had never mentioned. I shared my challenges in Moscow, the loneliness I sometimes felt in the crowded city, and the constant race against time. For the first time in years, we truly listened to each other. I realized how much I had missed her voice, her laughter, her wisdom hidden behind simple words. The resentment I carried dissolved into gratitude. Perhaps her lie was the only way to shatter the wall I had built around myself. The following days were filled with rediscovery. She took me to the old pier where we used to feed the seagulls, and we walked through the market where she once held my tiny hand, buying fruit and sweets. I saw Vladivostok through different eyes, not as the city I had escaped, but as a place rooted in who I was. Neighbors greeted me with surprise, marveling at how grown I looked, reminding me of childhood mischief. Everywhere I went, I felt both a stranger and a daughter coming home. My mother glowed with joy, and though I still wrestled with mixed emotions, I knew these moments were precious. One evening, I confronted her again about the lie. I told her how much it had hurt to believe she was ill. She listened quietly, then said something that stayed with me forever. Sometimes, a mother must use any means to bring her child back, not for herself alone, but because she knows the child needs it too. Her words struck a chord. She wasn't just being selfish. She had sensed how lost I was in my own life. By forcing me home, she had given me the pause I didn't know I needed. I understood then that her deception was born not of malice, but of love. The day of my departure arrived too quickly. As I packed my suitcase, my mother fussed over me, slipping small containers of homemade food into the bag, just like she used to when I was a student. At the airport, her embrace lingered, her eyes shining with unspoken words. I promised to visit more often, and for once, I meant it. The flight back to Moscow felt different. I no longer carried guilt alone, carried her love, her lessons, and the reminder of what truly mattered. Back in Moscow, life resumed its pace, but I was changed. I called her every day, sometimes just to share little things, sometimes to hear her laughter. I planned my schedule with visits in mind, no longer letting years slip away. Her lie had pulled me back into her orbit, but it had also realigned me with myself. I began to see how easily we lose sight of the people who shape us and how vital it is to hold on to them before time takes them away. Months later, I reflected on this strange journey that began with a lie. It was not the illness she claimed, but a different kind of sickness that had infected us to stays, neglect, silence. Her trick was the medicine, bitter at first, but healing in the end. I realized that sometimes love wears disguises, and truth hides behind false alarms. What mattered was not the method, but the outcome. I had found my way home again. Years passed, and my visits became regular. My mother grew older, but never stopped cooking for me, never stopped asking about my life, never stopped caring. I often thought back to that call, the trembling voice that turned my world upside down. If she hadn't pretended, perhaps I would have lost more than time. Perhaps I would have lost her entirely without ever making peace. Her lie had been her way of saving both of us. And so, whenever someone asked me about the strangest reason I had ever traveled, I smiled and said, because my mother pretended to be sick. They laughed, not knowing the depth behind those words. But I carried the truth in my heart. Sometimes, love needs a little deception to remind us of where we belong. In Vladivostok, in that small apartment, I had rediscovered my roots, my mother's love, and the bond that not even distance could break.